Slavery in the English-speaking world.
I will tell you the story of a young boy from the Niani area in the African country Gambia. I will tell you the story of Davda. It was near noon when the strange men attacked the village. There were only a few of them, but they threw strange fire at the soldiers so that they died. Then they put cold ropes around the arms of the men and started dragging them away. Davda could not understand what the men were saying, but he thought they could be from some other tribe, even though they wore strange bodysuits. After that they rounded up the boys and Davda and shoved them into a big piece of floating wood on the river. There were men like the ones who attacked the village on the piece of floating wood, and they also had the strange sticks that threw fire. The wood started moving down the river, and Davda heard a lot of screaming from the village. He was scared.
Approximately 12 million black Africans were transported from Africa during the Atlantic slave trade. This happened between the 16th to the 19th century, and most of them were sent to Brazil. Actually, only 5.4% of the slaves were sent to the United States. The demand for the slaves across the Atlantic Ocean started with the colonization of South America in the late 15th century. In the start of the Atlantic slave trade, African kings traded slaves for exotic goods from the New World such as tobacco, rum, and gold. The main issue for transporting African slaves was the shortage of potent labor. The native Indians of the New World died from European diseases and overwork, and therefore there was a need of new strong labor from Africa.
Convicts in African states could be punished by being enslaved and sold to the white man. It was not common to have functional prisons. Therefore they were sold. One of the national resources in Africa was the people and the labor they could provide.
A few moons later, the boys and Davda reached another part of the river. Next to the river lay a big lake, the biggest Davda had ever seen. He could not see the other shore. A bit out in the big lake lay something Davda had never seen before. He thought it to be a monster that lived out on the great lake. The men were pushing the boys towards the children of the great monster, who lay at the shore, and next to them were strange men whose skin was the color of the sand, but paler. The pale sandmen gave papers and fire sticks to the men who captured Davda, and then Davda was forced out on one of the small sea monsters. Davda believed that the small sea monsters were the offspring of the great one in the lake, and now the little sea monsters, with Davda and the boys on it, were going home.
Before they were shipped over the Atlantic, they were kept in so-called factories along the coast. The time they spent there varied, but almost 1 million people died during this time. While on board, the conditions for the about 200 passengers were horrible. People died from diseases or by committing suicide. The slaves were considered the captain's property, which meant that he and his crew could do whatever they wanted to them. Therefore, they were exposed to rape, torture, or murder.
When they reached the big monster, Davda had to crawl up the side of it, and then Davda was thrown together with the others from the tribe into the monster's stomach, where there were many other men. It was dark, and Davda did not like the smell. It smelled of death. The hole to the stomach closed, and the sea monster started moving. Davda could hear water and wind outside the monster, and the pale men were screaming in a strange language. In the stomach, Davda found some of his friends and the men from the village. Davda did not know how long he was inside the stomach. It was too dark. It felt like an eternity being stuck inside the smelly monster. Everything was wet and tasted salt. The monster's stomach did not feel like flesh.
Still today we don't know the exact number of how many people lost their lives during the transportation over the Atlantic Ocean. An estimated percentage of life loss is about 10 to 20% on the boats and an additional number on the transportation to the ships. Only 50% made it to the boats.
After a long time, Davda could hear that strange men were screaming more than before, and he could not hear the wind anymore. Outside the monster, Davda heard strange sounds, and he believed that they were in a big village. Soon after, the monster's stomach opened, and Davda could see the sun again. It hurt. The strange men pulled him up out of the monster, and Davda saw the biggest village he had ever seen. It was filled with the pale people, and they were all dressed in strange clothes Davda had never seen before. Their huts were very big and strange, and Davda felt very uncomfortable as they were forced down on the shore. On the shore there was a man dressed in very much cloth, who shook hands with the pale sandman and smiled.
The immigrants from Europe who established a new life as landowners in the New World needed workers for their plantations. Since America was the land of freedom for some people, it became the land of slavery for others. The American slave trade peaked in the late 18th century because of the African kingdom's economic needs to finance their own tribal wars. It was also a way to remove threats from other tribes. Approximately 18.3 million people were enslaved during this peak. The prominent countries for the slave trade were Portugal, Spain, and the British Empire.
When they arrived, the majority of the slaves had already been sold to plantations. Many of them had also been sold to mines in towns and countryside. Women were usually put into households where they had to cook, serve, and clean for their masters and mistresses.
In 1808, slavery became illegal in the British Empire. Slavery was abolished around 1860 in America when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The abolition of slavery was Lincoln's major presidential issue. The last slave ship to arrive to America was in 1859.
In 1998, the 23rd of August was designated by UNESCO as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition.
Davda was a young African boy who was robbed of his childhood and his means to be a human being. All this so that he could pick cotton to make clothes for the pale sandmen of the British Empire, who had stolen his life and his very identity. This story is entirely fictional, but based on a historic tragedy created by the Western society. After all, is slavery truly abolished?
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.